Hello there, kia ora. With the handover between Deputy Prime Ministers over King's birthday weekend, we're now around the halfway point of the scheduled term of this government. So I figured what better time to look at what this government and its ministers representing them have actually done so far this term, because the most common feedback that I keep getting is that this feels like an onslaught. So here's a bit of a speed run on some of what's happened in the last 18 months. And it started on election night, where one of their members actually celebrated their win as a victory for pale, male, and stale. They cancelled the new ferries with no replacements or knowing what the break fees were going to be by text message, repealed smoke-free laws after lying about claims of supply deficits in Northland, cancelled the first home buyers grant, ordered a review of Kāinga Ora from a social housing provider paid for out of the Urgent Housing Fund that was organised by text message because they're mates. Landlord tax changes costing us $2.9 billion. They gave Gumboot Friday millions through questionable acquisition processes, cancelled Whaikaha discretionary funding for disabled people without warning, revamped the school lunch program, putting hundreds out of work that have delivered low-quality meals to school kids, some of which have had to be imported from overseas. They've threatened to withhold funding to sports bodies over allowing trans women to compete in amateur sports, told health officials to stop worrying about people during pandemics, the ineffective youth boot camps, tax cuts that we couldn't afford that favoured higher incomes. They removed Te Reo from government departments. They cancelled the Māori Health Authority. They brought back charter schools, which are now spending 10 times the money on students than are given to the public schooling system. They repealed Section 7AA from the Oranga Tamariki Act. They cut benefit rates with re-indexing, including reduced incomes for disabled people, increased sanctions on benefits, including making people aged 18 and 19 be means tested by their parents, increased declination rates of emergency housing and didn't track where those kicked out went, but deny it's led to an increase in homelessness despite what on-the-ground experts have to say. They took out the provision for Treasury to worry about unemployment rates when it came to how they set rates of inflation. They increased the ability for lobbyists to lobby directly to MPs. They removed the Auckland regional fuel tax that paid for major transport infrastructure costs. They cancelled funding for Section 27 reports. They've had more protests held against them than any other government in history. They've delivered 2 of the lowest minimum wage increases ever, and they wanted to go lower. They disrespected Parliament by allowing muddy gumboots in the chambers to protest the horrors of regulation. They cut frontline services to the public sector. They've fired thousands of public servants. They lied constantly about the state of the books that they inherited before borrowing more in 2 years than Labour did over 6. Policies that have seen rents continue to rise. They cancelled Auckland Light Rail. They banned cell phones in classes based on reckons without evidence. They ignored the Chief Science Advisor's report on gang harm reduction to put in a ban on patches instead, which meant breaching freedom of speech laws, so they changed those, but David Seymour said he wouldn't do the same for Nazi insignia. They cut funding to customs. They plunged councils into debt with 3 waters repealing. They got upset when Auckland Museum said it wanted to refocus on a tikanga-led organisation. There was the removal of RSE guidelines in schools. They cancelled the reorganisation of Te Pukenga based on misleading debt data. They cancelled the Unified Health Service reformation. They cancelled funding to cycling and walking initiatives. They got rid of the Health New Zealand board to put in a commissioner, who was the one in charge of Auckland hospitals when they started leaking and growing mould. Before he was accused of cooking the books, then they fired him to reinstate the board. They forgot to fund life-saving promised cancer medications in the budget, so they had to take the funds from the next budget to pay for them after public outcry. They promised 500 new cops, then pushed out the deadline, and then admitted later that they still won't be able to meet it as record numbers of cops moved to Queensland. They complained about a poem about James Cook, cancelled Christmas parties. They caused a medical brain drain. They scaled back the Dunedin and Nelson Hospital upgrades significantly. There was the Treaty Principles Bill process, which led to the largest ever protest that this country's ever seen, costing us $4 million in wasted money so that ACT could whip up racism. They barred a reporter critical of the government's response to the abuse in state care report from attending the apology that they did. They created conditions that led to the fast increase in unemployment. They allowed kids at boot camps to be punished with physical violence after the minister ran out of an interview crying that it was so mean that anybody would ever suggest they'd let them do that. They drove up gang numbers. They cut funding to research on white supremacy and disinformation groups, as well as scientific and academic research areas. There was Andrew Bailey's drunken berating of a winery worker. There was increased use of ineffective 3 strikes laws. There was whatever the physical incident was involving Andrew Bailey. tax cuts for tobacco companies, an unnecessary Crown Observer to punish a Green Party mayor who, they just didn't really like. They claimed that renters were grateful for landlord tax cuts. They increased the number of people on benefits. They've removed 28 treaty provisions from various laws. They've appointed inappropriate people for the roles of Race Relations and Human Rights Commissioner. They're driving a reduction in the standard of living. They drove hundreds of thousands of Kiwis overseas. They changed family support programs that have been confusing, problematic, and underutilised. They took credit for interest rate and inflation number dropping, despite the fact that they're not related to government policy or government policy actually increasing inflation slightly. They floated privatisation of core services. They've cut Te Reo and Tikanga explanation course funding, cancelled fair pay agreements. Seymour called the public the great unwashed, set up conditions for property investors to outnumber first home buyers for the first time in a few years by changing the Bright Line test. They managed to somehow screw up twice the dates that women first got the vote in New Zealand, cancelled pay equity processes and claims under urgency. Some policies which saw an increase in violent crime are out there. There was the forced referenda and costs that go on to 44 local councils around Māori wards. They ordered the end of health services in the Hawke's Bay designed to deal with the disproportionate number of Māori men getting sick due to the lack of early medical intervention. They made up charts and lists to justify funding cuts. They made a fan of Elon Musk. They tanked the economy, leading to the worst recession since the 90s, the highest number of business insolvencies in 8 years, and, just putting off business vibes in general. They rolled back housing insulation rules, focused on fast-tracking fossil fuel extractions and overriding community concerns. They removed the well-being pillars from councils and demanded that they spend only on core services, despite 90% of all council funding already doing this. They threw out the local government report to modernise the local government sector. The Prime Minister told the country he thinks that Māori did cede sovereignty in 1840. They removed a tool for creating waitlist urgency, which included a small element that looked at ethnicity, despite it helping those most likely to be impacted with longer wait times from accessing needed medical care slightly faster because the people at Newstalk ZB said it was woke. They cancelled housing projects needed all over the country. They removed Te Reo greetings from official Matariki invitations. They lied about data that allowed them to change the maths curriculum. They slashed any focus on Māori from within the public service. They changed the free bowel cancer screening rules that will put more Māori and Pacifica men at risk of going undetected. They told the people of Greymouth that their council should build a new police station to replace the one that they currently have, which is full of black mould and is completely uninhabitable. They're refusing to hire nurses during a nationwide nursing shortage. They are shrinking poverty reduction targets instead of working to reduce poverty for children. They brought back co-payments on prescriptions. There was the underfunding of primary healthcare leading to price increases for GPs. They put future climate targets and with it international trade agreements in jeopardy. There's massive underfunding to services provided by and through Oranga Tamariki. There's undeclared dinners and secret meetings with lobbyists. Costello was acting contrary to law to hide data about tobacco law changes. There's the blanket speed increases in communities. They launched a second COVID inquiry to placate the cookers and conspiracy theorists in New Zealand first, and repealed the Therapeutic Products Act, making it easy to sell snake oil for people who want to manipulate vulnerable Kiwis. They cut pay top-ups to disabled workers who are working for below the minimum wage. They claim that trying to save every at-risk species was just too expensive. They unlawfully withheld information on the fast-track bill. Winston lied about being consulted on media plans. A gun nut is overhauling the Firearms Act against the concerns of the police and industry experts to make weapons like the one used by the Christchurch shooter easier to access. They changed guidelines on how a sick child should be concerned or considered before they can take a day off school. They cut funding and staff to the Suicide Prevention Office so it would essentially only continue in name only. They launched Local Water Done Well after cancelling 3 waters, which saw potential price rises go up to around 25%, and then claimed that their new plans save people money from the price rises that they created by cancelling 3 waters. They started a fight with a former Australian Foreign Affairs Minister. They changed fees free from first year to last year, reducing the incentive to go into trades and study. They cut women and Māori out of sector shake-up conversations with the Ministry of Regulation. They refused actions against power price rises, increased the cost of groceries, threatened funding to state broadcasters, and then cut funding to RNZ. They celebrated their first 100 days in office with expensive crayfish dinners. Multiple MPs and the Prime Minister claimed expenses that they felt they were entitled to but didn't need in a cost of living crisis. They ordered banks to ignore climate change, yelled racist taunts at migrant MPs, hinted at future asset sales, let a racist rewrite the English curriculum, which included outdated teaching methodology, cancelled work from home for public servants, tanked the wholesale trade sector and construction industries, tanked the tourism numbers, scrapped the clean car discount, tanking sales with it as well, failed to consult with Pacific countries about changes to RSE worker change rules, tried to stop public scrutiny of illegal commercial fishing practices. They ended cultural reports in courts for those who can't afford them privately. One of them drove a Land Rover up the steps of Parliament despite warnings not to and went without punishment. Created the worst recession since the 90s with everything that they've done economically. They've overturned foreshore and seabed customary rights, refused to help create protections for rainbow youth amid hate campaigns, driven a rise in hate crimes by normalising the actions and behaviours that target protected groups. Luxon got called out by an international fashion guru, dropped in international rankings in corruption, rushed through more laws in their first 100 days than any government ever has, removed the ability to extend migrant exploitation protection work visas, threatened to cut funding to the Waitangi National Trust, ordered the High Court to reconsider a ruling about a racist realtor that she lost, took part in a witch hunt against a Green MP based on erroneous online Twitter reckons from an anti-trans activist, deliberately misquoted Tamitha Paul around police funding, tried passing a law that stopped co-governance on the incorrect belief it meant more votes for one group over another. They froze the income of 3,000 mostly single-parent families. They made it easier to kill native wildlife. They used the C word and clothing to try and distract from pay equity changes that they were getting roasted over. They tried normalising a secretive sect that one of their members is part of. The sect is currently under investigation for sexual abuse incidents with both the police and the FBI. They reduced the support for abuse and state care survivors. They rolled back workplace safety measures. There's means testing, as I mentioned before, for those teenagers. There's suggested prosecuting of parents for truant kids, claimed that emails from Indian migrants were tantamount to spam, changed who decides what ECE teachers get paid, introduced citizens arrest laws, the one policy so far that has an overpaid task force run by National, changed accommodation and supplement support laws under urgencies that will mean disabled carers will be left without financial support, halved the KiwiSaver government contributions and made changes which will see low-income earners pressured into not increasing their contribution, underfunded almost every public sector area with funding increases lower than the rate of inflation, meaning real-world decreases in funding. There's the Regulatory Standards Bill. They handed down the longest ever ban for MPs from the House for celebrating the end of the Treaty Principles Bill with a traditional display of tikanga. They looked into the ability to arrest MPs as well before the Privileges Committee. They've rushed through laws to, everything. The Waitangi Tribunal being able to rule on them is what their aim is when they rush these things through. They're paying private hospitals to become after-hours emergency providers instead of properly funding ER services and health access. They tried to ban social media for under 16-year-olds. They made cuts to Oranga Tamariki without investigating the impacts it would have on children and families. There's the massive family boost rollout screw-up that meant only 250 families received the full amount. They cut funding to vulnerable patient helpers in hospitals, ECE sector overhauls that teachers have warned will lead to increased accidents, MPs using private email servers without proper security coverage for government work, calls for longer prison sentences, harsher punitive responses and less support frameworks for offenders that deal with the root cause of crime. They've been withholding the updated guidelines reviews on gender-affirming care for trans people, telling mayors that they are the ones who are meant to stop truancy, any of New Zealand First gender ideology bullshit like bathroom bills and legally defining gender. They've removed voter rights for prisoners. They've cut a third of all IT roles in Health New Zealand. They're looking at tolling now completed roads that have already been paid for. They made up numbers to try and stop pay equity claims from salaried medical staff protesting. They started selling visas to rich foreigners. The Foreign Affairs Minister went to a Pacific Island forum and told them climate change doesn't exist. They directed Health New Zealand to stop saying the term pregnant people, fired Phil Goff for asking questions about Donald Trump at an event for people to ask hard questions about holding power to account. There's been race baiting and complaining about Māori, punching down on Māori, women, and the poor. And that's just what I can remember from the last 18 months. And I know there's some double ups in there, and I can also guarantee I've probably missed a whole bunch of stuff. There's a reason why, for so many people, being under this government feels like an onslaught. Because it really is, to our senses, to our way of life, to our wallets, and to the people around us. And that makes it so much harder to really get a grasp on everything that's happening and being able to see how these actions have impacted everyone. So do your best to keep in mind what you can and what else gets rushed, pushed, and shoved in our ways between now and whenever the next election is. Because the parties are now ramping up their campaigns for 2026. And for the coalition, they're going to be hoping that by then you'll have forgotten what it is that they've actually done since taking office. Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.